could you speak about how you've noticed, maybe in your own experience, but also as a reader, the way that American labor is covered in the left press, the alternative press, and the corporate press?
Well, the main thing about American labor coverage is how much less there is now than there used to be. You go back to the decades immediately following World War II, let's say, and every major paper had a designated labor beat reporter, and some of them became real stars. The great Murray Kempton, who I think may have been the greatest journalist of, mid-20th century America, a great columnist, but began as the labor reporter at the New York Post. I'm a judge for something called the Sidney Hillman Foundation, which is a foundation that gives annual awards for socially conscious journalism, which was established by the Amalgamated Clothing Workers as a memorial to their president, Sidney Hillman, who was with John L. Lewis, one of the founders of the CIO, and was probably the union leader closest to Roosevelt. And when Hillman died in 1946, it was like, banner headlines on all the New York papers. This was huge. You can't imagine a labor leader dying today and that having, more than a few paragraphs. I was at the latest Hillman Awards. There's a special award for labor historians that a special committee gives at these annual awards in New York, and the one in the past year was awarded to Melvin Dubofsky, who started as a graduate student writing on labor history in the mid-1950s, and in his acceptance speech he noted when he started there were no labor historians. He had to find like two around the country. He was at Cornell. There was like none at Cornell, none in the Ivy. I mean, it was like no one did it. And I was sitting there thinking, when Melvin Dubofsky started writing his dissertation, there were no labor historians, and there were 200, maybe more, labor beat reporters at America's daily newspapers. Now there are maybe more than 500 labor historians around the country, and 2 labor beat reporters for American newspapers. There's my friend Steve Greenhouse at the New York Times, and there's Chris Marr at the Wall Street Journal, and that's all there is. The Washington Post, for instance, had a good labor reporter, very good guy, Frank Swoboda, who stepped down in the mid-90s. And then they had a terrifically smart political reporter, Tom Edsall, on the beat of labor's role in politics. And then when Edsall left, no one. I mean, individual reporters get thrown in to cover a particular story as it develops. They may or may not have background. They sure the hell don't have a lot of background. So the most striking thing about labor reporting in the mainstream media is its disappearance. And its disappearance, of course, tracks the shrinking of the American labor movement as a whole, but it also opens the door for the ratio of misinformation to information that's out there about unions rises steadily, because there's, even if it weren't rising, it would be rising as a ratio because the amount of information out there on labor unions declines steadily. Most mainstream labor coverage, therefore, takes the form of covering like a labor conflict, a strike, or what have you. And unions have different levels of ability to try to shape that story. I would say the worst single, almost criminally inept conduct by an American union was that of the United Auto Workers during the time of when the auto bailout was being debated. The story got around that automakers make $100 an hour. Auto workers, if they have seniority, if they've been there a while, make $28 an hour. And if they've been hired since 2007, they make $15 an hour, which annualizes to $30,000 a year. Now, the UAW, under Walter Reuther back in the day, and his first two successors, Leonard Woodcock and Doug Fraser, was the greatest American union ever, and the smartest, and they could have handled this terrifically. But there's been a steady decline of presidents until the current one, who wasn't there at the time of the bailout. They have a very interesting, smart new president named Bob King. But under the president then, they just put out no refutation of this. And I mean, that had a real effect in the level of public support for unions. The left press has certainly a more, I would say, not even positive, but just more balanced approach to covering unions. But its reach is not that great. Sometimes it can degenerate into cheerleading. And the really hard questions like how do you retain a unionized workforce, say, in manufacturing at a time of globalization, things like this. How do you maintain living standards in private sector contracts when all the pressure is downward? That's the kind of stuff that's hard to find almost anywhere. I mean, I try to write some of that stuff, and that's by virtue of having spent a bunch of time checking out what they do in Germany and elsewhere, and these are all kind of systemic questions, and they are grappled with sometimes in the left press. And a guy like Steve Greenhouse in the New York Times, when his editors allow him, can grapple with that a little. But you don't see much of it. You know, back in the day, when I was a young person in Los Angeles in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, the LA Times, which at that point was lavishing money on editorial and on stories, had a great labor reporter named Harry Bernstein. And I even when I say this, even though I read it and I saved it over these many years, I don't believe it. They sent him to Sweden, and he did a series of stories on Swedish unions and Swedish social democracy. Not just a series. He did 12 long stories in the LA Times about this. This is like, you know, talking about the planet Mars today. It is inconceivable that this would occur to an editor if you put a gun to his head and said, you got to do this today. You know, this would not happen. But that kind of stuff, which is exactly what American journalism needs to do about labor. Look at its position here, its position elsewhere. Look at the new concern about rising inequality. Is there any connection between the evisceration of unions and the rise of inequality? Duh. Well, you know, it would be nice to see some stories on that. There is the connection is causal, is what it is. But those kinds of stories remain, you know, few and far between.
And why is that? Why was this journalist able to go to Sweden and do 12 in-depth pieces on their system at that time? Why did the American journalistic system allow that, the media system, and today it doesn't?
Well, partly, I mean, some of that is budget. I mean, let's face it. The LA Times, as I said, was lavishing money on its news coverage in those days. Today, not only, it's not a question of not sending your labor reporter to Sweden, it's not having a labor reporter, and barely having any reporters in Europe, period. So it's before we even get to the ideological dimensions of that answer, we need to get simply to the newspaper crisis dimension of that answer. So that's that. I think, like most Americans, a lot of editors have been simply slow to make this connection between America's rising economic problems, the whole issue of the evisceration of the middle class, which I think has only really finally become a widely agreed upon phenomenon, that it exists over the last couple years, although obviously it has been out there for quite a long time. And the fact that the concept of unions is still a kind of alien concept to a lot of editors and a lot of mainstream opinion leaders. And, you know, they too fall prey to, well, at some level, in the back of their heads, they think that auto workers may make $100 an hour, and they think, you know, the teachers' unions have become the great scapegoat for the failings in American education, just as American education, to a certain degree, is a scapegoat for the failings of the American economy. I mean, Germany, to cite that example, doesn't send the percentage of folks to college that we do, but they have a spectacular vocational educational program, and they've preserved and upgraded their manufacturing sector, and that's a function to a certain degree of their having a different financial sector, part of which directly funds these small manufacturing companies. They don't have to worry about their quarterly reports and executive bonuses, and they don't get their money on the stock market, so if the stock price drops, they're out of there. The whole system is different. But here, a lot of our opinion leaders have said, well, it must be the level of education, and that must be the fault of teachers' unions.